Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we're going to be discussing the life of Big Tyme from the 8-9 family, Swan Bloods. Now, Big Tyme was born Barry Williams in 1962 in Los Angeles, California. Now, as an infant, he would be taken in by his auntie after his mother did not want to bring him home. He would go on to live with his auntie on the 800 block of 89th Street. But sadly, by the age of 4 years old, he would have to move in with his grandmother after his aunt had too many kids to take care of at the time. Now, his grandmother only stayed a few blocks away in the Avalon Garden projects, which would soon be the home of the notorious 8 Avalon Garden Crips. Now, his grandmother would take great care of him, spoiling him with anything that he ever needed, including toys. She would also take him to church with her every single Sunday, where he would eventually start singing in the children's choir. Now, as a kid, he would attend 93rd Elementary School, where he would join the band and play the trumpet. Now, after elementary, he would later on attend Drew Junior High School, and around this time, he would become a lieutenant in the neighborhood cadet corps. Now, this small group was started by a man by the name of Joe Lewis, who was trying to keep the kids off the streets and out of trouble. But it wouldn't be too long before Barry would start going back and forth from his grandmother's house back to his auntie house on 89th Street. Now, anytime he was on 89th Street, he was hanging out with his friends, and they would form a group, and they would start going by the neighborhoods. Now, by 1975, he was no longer that good church kid. He would start rebelling. Now, Barry, along with his friends, would start beating up kids for their lunch money, any chances they got during school. Now, at this time, the Crips were already making headwaves through South Central, and by 1979, Barry and his friends would find themselves getting into fights with kids across Central Avenue, and those group of kids across Central Avenue would eventually start calling themselves the East Coast Neighborhood Crips. Now, Barry and his homies would soon go from calling themselves the Neighborhoods now to the 8-9 family Bloods, and they would become a force to be reckoned with. Eventually, the 8-9s would then expand and open up and set up shop on 92nd Street, and that would be the 9 Deuce families. And with the 89th Street and the 9 Deuces, together, they will come to be known as the Neighborhood Family Bloods. Now, with the gang violence on the rise, Barry was known for having that vision to wanting to take the hood to another level. And with this type of mindset, this would lead to him being called Big Tyme. Now, with all the trouble he was getting into during his teen years, he would eventually get transferred and start getting bussed out to Compton's Dominguez High School. Now, around this time, the gangs were no longer just fighting, but now gunplay was on the table. So Barry would start carrying himself a gun to school and everywhere else that he went to. Now, he and his homies would start robbing and jacking people to make ends meet. Now, by the age of 18, he would find himself becoming a father very soon. Now, with his girlfriend being pregnant and the stress of going to school, he would decide to drop out. Now, although at the time he was nickel and diming in the street, hustling and robbing, it still wasn't enough to keep food on the table. So this would lead to him to start working at the Watts Labor Community Center as a security guard. Now, although he was working security, Big Tyme was still out in the streets causing havoc. Now, at some point in time, the Neighborhood Family Bloods would form an alliance with a nearby hood called the Mad Swans, and they would start to go by the Family Swan Bloods. Now, this alliance would make them a big threat against their rival Crips, especially the East Coast, who had multiple sets at the time. Now, the LAPD had deemed the 8-9 Swans as one of the most dangerous gangs in LA. But not only were they considered the most dangerous, but they were considered the most militant and organized. The LAPD would reveal that the 8-9s at the time will commit robberies and then go back to their headquarters and monitor all police calls over radio scanners. It was also stated that the 8-9s would have members attend college and take up criminal justice classes so they can learn how to handle police interrogations. Now, by the time the early 80s hit, Big Tyme would turn it up in the streets after he and his pregnant girlfriend were both shot by the Crips. Now, once he recovered, his hatred for the Crips would only get worse. And on July 19, 1980, the Swans got wind of a Crip by the name of Carey Island at a local neighborhood meeting near a church on 89th Street. Now, outside was a group of nearly 50 people, all enjoying themselves, having a good time. And that's when Big Tyme and the Swans would pull up at the event with everybody wearing red bandanas over their mouths. Barry, along with his 2 homies, were all armed with 12 gauges. As they entered into the crowd of people, that's when Barry stepped up and yelled out, "Where Carey at? This Neighborhood Family Bloods, 89th Street." And according to witnesses, Big Tyme and the Swans started shooting. A total of 3 people were struck as the crowd dispersed. The Swans would immediately flee the scene, and shortly after, the police would arrive to find the chaos. Now, out of the 3 people injured, 1 man was seriously injured, which was a 53-year-old who was suffering from gunshot pellets to both the chest and the arm. Now, he would survive his injuries, but he would require heart surgery due to the extent of his injuries. Now, some of the witnesses at the event would identify Big Tyme as a shooter due to his silver tooth, which got exposed as his bandana fell from his face during the shooting. Now, the following day, Big Tyme would be arrested. Now, police would state that during taking his mug shot, he would stick his tongue out while taunting the police. Now, even though Big Tyme and his homies were identified in this shooting, this case would ultimately be dismissed due to witnesses not showing up to the preliminary hearing, with some of them being in fear for their lives, and some due to a technicality of witnesses not being notified the exact date and time of his hearing. But now a free man and back on the street, Big Tyme will hop right back into the game. Now, only a few weeks later, he will be out looking to eliminate more rival gang hoods. Now, at the time, the 8-9 families was also beefing with a local gang called the Meadow Park Boys, who had a very close alliance with the Avalon Garden Crips. So on June 16th, the 8-9 families will hold a meeting in the set. Now, the plan was to drive around Meadow Park and shoot whoever was outside, whether they was Crips or Meadow Park Boys. Now, Big Tyme's weapon of choice was a .357. So the Swans would all hop into a blue Cadillac and drive to the park. At around 9 p.m., a group of men and female stood outside the park talking near the stage. Big Tyme and the Swans would then pull up. He, along with another blood, would hop out the car and slowly creep up and then hide in some nearby bushes behind the group. Now, as the group is talking, Big Tyme and his homie would then hop out and start shooting. Multiple people would be hit with gunfire, and immediately, Big Tyme and his homie would flee the scene. Now, by the time the police would arrive, they would discover a male and a female who had both sustained non-life-threatening injuries from this attack. But they would also discover a 20-year-old man by the name of Billingsley, who was fatally wounded with a gunshot wound to his back as he tried to flee. Now, sadly, Donald would die from his injuries. Now, witnesses would tell police that they recognized Big Tyme as one of the shooters. So after being identified, the police would issue a warrant for his arrest, but they were unable to locate him. Now, with the police looking for him, Big Tyme would lay low over the next several months. Now, the 8-9's beef with the Avalons and the East Coast Crips had only gotten worse. So Big Tyme, although laying low, decided to put together a plan to take him out. So on March 25th, 1982, he would call a meeting with the other neighborhood Bloods to deal with their Crip problem. Now, he would lay down the law, and his plan was to protect the hood at all costs from any rival Crips who were deemed a threat. At around 6 p.m., the Swans would go out and start looking for Crips. So once they hit Rosecrans and Central, they would spot a man by the name of Marcellus Gray standing outside his van at a grocery store. They would pull up and hop out with their guns out and take the man's van. Now, eventually, they would hit 88th and McKinley Avenue, which was near where both the Avalon Gardens Crip hood set and the Swans hood set. Now, Big Tyme, once he began to drive near the intersection, he would notice 2 Crips riding on bikes. Now, neither of these Crips was from Avalon or East Coast, but they were from Grape Street. And one of the dudes on the bikes was known as Bones. Now, at the time, Bone was on his way to see his girlfriend, known as Lady Bone. Now, the van would pull up right near Bones. In the heat of the moment, words would be exchanged, and only moments later, a hand would extend out the van, aiming a .38, and it would open fire. 4 shots would be heard as Bones would fall off his bike onto the pavement. Now, bystanders would run up to attend to Bones, who was bleeding on the ground. Now, police and EMTs would arrive to find Bones had been shot 5 times in the head, neck, shoulder, back, and chest. And sadly, he would die from his injuries. Now, as the police began to canvass the area, they would locate that van abandoned only 4 blocks away. Now, an eyewitness named Patricia would come forward and pick out Big Tyme out of a photo lineup as a shooter that she saw that day. Now, only 2 months later, Big Tyme would be arrested for 2 counts of murder and attempted murder, which stemmed back from the Middle Park shooting. Now, while in county awaiting a trial, the Grape Street Crips had put a hit out on Big Tyme for killing Bones. Now, at the time in county, the Bloods were heavily outnumbered. So Big Tyme would make sure that he got a hold of a shank just in case somebody tried to run up on him in county. Now, soon it would come to light that Bones had been mistaken for a Crip from Avalon's named Silky. Now, while behind bars, Big Tyme would find out that the police had an eyewitness. And this was an eyewitness that Big Tyme was familiar with, which was Patricia, because when he was a kid, he was a cadet who worked for her husband named Joe. So in 1983, a young YG blood named Snoop Dogg would pull up outside the witness's house on 87th Street. And as Patricia and her grandson were sitting inside the house, Snoop Dogg would open fire. He would let off nearly 50 shots into that home, barely missing Patricia and her grandson. Now, shockingly, nobody was injured in this shooting. Now, eventually by 1985, Big Tyme will go to trial, and he would soon find out that a lot of his homies had turned on him and were set to testify against him. Now, the first trial will be the murder for Bones from Grape Street. Now, the eyewitness Patricia would tell the jury that at the time of the shooting, she was riding in the passenger seat of a station wagon with her friend. She would go on to state that while they were stopped at the stop sign on 88th Street in McKinley, that she saw a van stop in the middle of the intersection, and that's when she saw the driver's face, which was Big Tyme. Now, she would then go on to explain that she watched the van, followed the young men on the bikes, and somebody inside the van yelled out, "Let's fuck them up." And moments later, she would see a hand come from out the driver's side window and open fire. Now, another witness would take the stand, and that was Kenneth Hayes, who was with Bones at the time, riding the bikes. Now, he would testify that he saw a van pull up and somebody inside start talking to Bones. And he would witness that whoever was on that driver's side pulled out a firearm and opened fire, killing Bones. Now, at this point, the prosecution would start calling ex-blood gang members, who would then testify against Big Tyme. One member in particular would tell a court that after the murder, Big Tyme had bragged about shooting an Avalon Crip named Silky, who was wearing flu clothing. Another blood, who was actually Big Tyme's childhood friend, named Arthur Cox, would testify that while he was in county with Big Tyme, that he had ordered a blood by the name of Snoop Dogg to go and shoot and kill the witness Patricia to prevent her from testifying. Next, the prosecution would then call another ex-Swan blood member by the name of Simmons, who would testify that while one night he was out smoking with Snoop Dogg, he would claim that Snoop Dogg admitted to shooting up the witness house at the orders of Big Tyme. The teenager named Snoop Dogg would take the stand, but he would deny ever speaking about shooting anybody and deny ever talking with Simmons. Now, once it was the defense turn, the defense would question the eyewitness named Patricia and attack her credibility on identifying Big Tyme as a shooter. Originally, during the preliminary hearing, the defense would point out that Patricia stated that she was unsure who the actual shooter was. But Patricia would respond, and she would claim that during the time, she was simply afraid to identify Big Tyme as the shooter due to his gang ties. Now, this would lead to the defense requesting for a mistrial due to the eyewitness conflicting statements, but the courts would deny it. Now, Big Tyme's girlfriend and auntie would also testify on his behalf. Now, his auntie would testify that Big Tyme and his girlfriend were at her house at around 6 p.m. the night of the shooting, and that before she left at 7 p.m., that her nephew and his girlfriend were still at her house. But ultimately, in the end, Big Tyme would be found guilty of first-degree murder, and he would be sentenced to death. Now, the following year, in 1986, he was set to go to trial for the murder of Donald Billingsley. Now, at this trial, the main eyewitness will be a young lady who went to school with Big Tyme, and she would state that she saw him walk up and hide behind the bushes and then open fire on the crowd. Now, another witness would testify, and this would be his childhood friend named Arthur Cox. Now, Cox would tell the courts that Big Tyme was responsible for multiple shootings, which included shootings that the police didn't even know about. He would testify that one of the shootings was an elderly white lady that Big Tyme allegedly attempted to carjack, and when she didn't give the car up, he shot her in the head. Now, Cox would also state that Big Tyme had been doing crime since he was a kid. Now, he would then go on to admit that he was at the meeting before the murder of Donald Billingsley, which took place later on that night. But he would make it clear that after the shooting took place, Big Tyme stated that he was not responsible for the death of Donald Billingsley. Now, with all this evidence against him, by the end of the trial, Big Tyme would be found guilty of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. And he would be sentenced to 34 years to state prison. And after serving 41 years in prison, Big Tyme will be exonerated for the murder for Bones from Grape Street. After multiple prosecution misconduct and even false testimonies given by his own homies who had testified against him, claiming that he admitted to the murders. But for a short while, he would still remain in prison for the murder of Donald Billingsley. But a few years later, he would eventually be a free man. I would like to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.